Ladies and gentlemen, this is White Lightning 777 coming to you with another video about, and this particular topic I'm going to cover today is why Patriarch Bartholomew, the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, is right to endorse the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the actual new Ukrainian church, as opposed to the Tsarist remnant that's been there for many, many generations. We have to first examine before we, and he's been getting some flack and some, criticism from certain other people, from certain other orthobros, because he actually stood up and did the right thing, which is not too common. Usually, if all the popular people are mad at you, that generally means you're doing something right, usually, in my experience. But we first have to examine, before we look at this question, like what, according to canon law, is the relationship of Holy Orthodoxy to the state. First of all, every country should have its own national church. Holy Orthodoxy is the original Christian nationalism. I mean, it goes all the way back to the Edict of Milan, when Constantine legalized Christianity, and together with the Christians who were newly legalized got together with the Roman government officials, and they even started building churches and cathedrals throughout the empire. Okay, so every country has to have its own, its own patriarch, and that patriarch needs to be in the capital of that particular country. The liturgy, we don't have sacred languages. It's always offered in the vernacular. According to canon law, the liturgy, the divine liturgy, should be offered in the native language of its adherents. Like even when, for example, traditional Catholic Latin Mass churches adopt Western Rite Orthodoxy, they're told, don't change a thing except you have to translate the Latin into English. This is America. You have to offer it in English. It's one of the few areas where they even agree with Protestants. Okay, so you have to have a language. Every city in the country should have its own bishop, and the country should have one jurisdiction. You shouldn't have overlapping jurisdictions. The other aspect, of course, to be an Orthodox, especially a priest or a bishop, is you can't be a member. You can't pray in heterodox or heretical churches or be members of heretical organizations such as the Freemasons. For example, is oft cited banned because of their heresy and Gnosticism. Okay, because again, you just can't serve Christ in some Gnostic demiurge or some other master. You can't practice two religions at once. You can't. For example, it's not considered, it is a violation of canon law, for example, to proclaim I'm an Orthodox Christian in public, but in your private life go practice witchcraft or whatever. That's another situation that people run across from time to time. So we have to ask ourselves, which of the two churches is actually Ukrainian? Well, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is run by Dominko, he's the patriarch of that church, is in the capital city. He meets all of those qualifications. Every one of those is met. Now, there are some things that they're doing. I mean, some of the, like other Eastern European countries, Ukraine never had a Spanish Inquisition or really crusaders marching through there or anything, so there are still people there who are bloodline witches that have been doing this for thousands of years, and again and looking the other, and maybe looking the other way is something that is an issue that they can arise from time to time in Eastern Europe. The other thing that they're doing is that and this is according to Ukrainian friend of mine. She's female. Despite being female, she's actually in the military fighting. She claims that the new church is telling people that the Soliviki, who are that's just a Russian word for oligarch, that these Solivikis are actually vampires. Now, if you look at church dogma, the church does believe that angels and demons exist. The church has not dogmatized whether aliens, vampires, or werewolves exist. We just don't know. There's nothing. You can't point to any particular ecumenical council that said this is fake. You can't point to anyone that said, yeah, we verified it. Absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, although that is there. But, essentially, the Russian Mafia running Russia is plenty bad enough. They don't have to be demonized even worse. And even if, and whether or not they're vampires is actually the least important question. It's the behavior. It's their control of the system that is the problem. Again, before I get into this, your ROCOR church, your Russian Orthodox Church down the street from your house in London or Baltimore or anywhere else in the world outside of Russia is fine. They're not any more likely to have issues than anybody else. The difference between, and this is important before I get into this, the difference between Russians who leave Russia, immigrate to other countries, and are willing to learn a foreign language makes them not typical Russians at all. We can't judge the Russians inside Russia by the Russians who are outside of Russia, and vice versa. Okay. But we also have to look at the stark truth. Now, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is, basically one of the second, is if it works, is only the second church to declare itself autocephalous unilaterally and be recognized by Constantinople. Know what the first one was? It was the Russian Orthodox Church in 1488. So what's, canonical, what's lawful in 1488, it should be lawful in 2019, which is when they did that. And part of this, again, and it took them about 150 years to convince everybody else to go back into communion with them, with the Russians in 1488. Now, the Ukrainian church is still in the process of getting into communion with other Orthodox churches. I'm sure that the Antiochians and the Serbians and the Poles and everybody, they're probably sending in their parishioners or anybody that can speak Ukrainian to see if they're doing the Divine Liturgy right and to check the dogma, and they're, going through the process. And there's always a political thing to this. Orthodoxy isn't, it's one of the most organized religions that's ever existed. And that process is messy, and it can take decades. That's to be expected. But again, we have to ask why. The Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, something that's called whatever, and it's not Ukrainian. The Divine Liturgy is in Russian. They're not, now, yes, over 90% of Ukrainians are bilingual and they can speak both Ukrainian and Russian. That's not an excuse. Regardless of how many languages the population speaks, the Divine Liturgy must be offered in the native tongue of the particular country that you're in. And since Orthodoxy follows the world, if you have national churches, what happens when nations split apart is the church in that nation has to split apart too. If, let's say, Texas seceded from the United States, well, the Orthodox Church of America that's in Texas would become the Orthodox Church of Texas. They'd have to choose a metropolitan or a patriarch. They just would. That's just the way it is. If you do that, you have to respond to worldly affairs. Countries can and do fight wars with each other. And that's why you have national churches. And it is the duty of the national church to pray for the leaders, to support the military, and yes, to obey all just laws. You can't commit sedition. You can't claim, I'm above all of the laws, especially laws concerning espionage, sedition, and treason, which this Russian church, surprise, surprise, in Ukraine, has, surprise, surprise, broken. The Russian church in Ukraine, the one that's been there, the one that was there that you're familiar with, in fact, has a patriarch in Moscow that so far as I know, has probably never even set foot in Ukraine. They offer a liturgy in Russian, not Ukrainian, and again, and we also have to question whether that particular church itself is canonical. The issue isn't whether the new Ukrainian church is canonical. It is. I mean, it is a new calendarist, Holy Orthodox Church. They believe the same thing that your Greek Orthodox Church believes, your Antiochian or your Serbian or anybody else. And fortunately, in the United States, the Patriarch of Constantinople has taken charge of all of the Ukrainian churches outside of Ukraine. So if you're going to a Ukrainian church in the United States and that church is in communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople, then your church is in communion with the other churches. So you don't have to, you kind of sidestep the problem. The problem is if you're in Ukraine itself. At this time, they're in the process of talking to all of the other patriarchs, and they've so far been recognized by Constantinople. But in terms of being canonical, the question really comes back to the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay, you have to understand that Russia is controlled by the Siloviki, who are oligarchs. These are satanic, Kabbalist types, atheistic. They're mainly sociopaths. Some of them are Jewish. They're certainly not Christian. They don't, and if being a Freemason disqualifies you from being an Orthodox Christian, obviously being in the Russian Mafia does as well. And that is the group who runs that. I mean, you can't serve two masters. You can't serve the mob and Christ. You just can't. And if you have a government, a church, and every institution in Russia that's just an appendage to this mafia, that really the only authority they answer to is Xi Jinping in China, if anybody, or nobody. I mean, you're dealing with a group that not only started the Ukraine war, but is the largest non-governmental outlaw organization. They have the largest illegal organ trade in the world. Those Ukrainian kids, well, it may be comforting to the families to think, well, they're just bitten a little bit by vampires. I mean, that's not true. Their organs are harvested. Same with the other prisoners. If the organs are unsuitable, then the Russians will trade them back for their own soldiers. They're never coming back. They're just not. And Putin isn't even indicted at The Hague for kidnapping. I mean, the Tsar is dead. The Russian flag has the double eagle with the church, with the cross on the one head and the crown of the Tsar on the other. The Tsar is dead. The Russian monarchy doesn't exist anymore, and frankly, we don't want to bring it back. And Ukrainians, for canonical reasons as well as very practical reasons, want their own church. I mean, let's put it this way. Let's say you have a friend who happens to be black. Okay? Now, would you, under any circumstances, tell them to go to David Duke's Christian Identity Church when there was, say, I don't know, even an Ethiopian Orthodox Church or even a Black Baptist Church, another alternative available? Under what circumstances would you, throw caution to the wind and tell them, yes, you should go to David Duke's church? I mean, the answer is obviously none. On the theory that, well, y'all are from the South anyway. I mean, the answer is obviously none. Now, you might counter, well, that's an American example. That's not like Russia and Ukraine. In fact, you're right. Between the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, all of the czars that have tried to ban the Ukrainian language, between the Holodomor, between Putin's actions, Russians have killed millions, tens of millions of non-Russian Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe. And they've been doing it for 600 years. The Ukrainian government has documented 130 attempts by Russia to genocide their people. And that's just one country over the past 600 years. Okay? To give you perspective, Jews have only been persecuted 109 times over the past 4,000 years. This makes non-Russian Slavs, thanks to the existence of this Soloviki class of overlords that have been there for centuries. This makes them possibly the most persecuted group of people on the face of the earth. And obviously, the Ukrainians don't want to mess with that. I mean, if your kids are going to go on a field trip, it shouldn't be questioned whether they're going to, be locked up on a Russian military base. And even, food and water, like during the coffee hours, it's an open security is an open question. Suppose you were a Trump voter. Would you accept food or drink from Hillary Clinton? Even in the United States, we see leftist femoid nurses that say they won't treat ICE officers over politics. I mean, don't you think that perhaps one of the most murderous countries in the world, only recently, only the CCP has killed more people than the Russian czars and Soviets and Putin, okay? And historically, only Muslims have killed more people than the Russian Empire or its descendants. These, obviously, there's a huge conflict of interest. You can't claim that an entire nation of people, that every woman in Ukraine is a witch and every man is a Nazi, and then claim, but we can still minister to those people. Bigotry disqualifies you from ministry. And there's plenty of Russians that have come back from the front that need help. There's plenty of Russians that are addicted to crocodile, sold to them by their own leader who pockets the money, by the way. There's a legitimate security issue. Patriarch Bartholomew is simply looking at reality for what it is. And even the Brokhor nun, Sister Vasa, has joined the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And even when you look at the war, thousands, the Ukrainians have entire divisions of Russian POWs that voluntarily switch sides and sign up for the Ukrainian army. I mean, now you're always going to have a few people switch sides during a war if they're captured by the other side, but not thousands of them. The enormity of that speaks volumes about just how degenerate and morally bankrupt the Soloviki is, and anything they touch is. We have to understand that, and the hypocrisy of some of these Z people, okay, in the West. They're living in the West. They're not living in Russia. They could say nice things about Putin, but, I don't see them volunteering to join Wagner. I don't see them, Putin will give you, if you want Putin to put a rifle in your hand, he'll happily do it. I collect Eastern European weapons. I could literally go in. I've had Wagner Group and them propose me and try to bribe me into making pro-Russia content or even flying over there, all expenses paid. And I told them to pound sand and a few other words I won't repeat, with women and children watching. By the way, I'm partially Polish, among other things. So, again, trust me, don't trust Russia. A family member had to get political asylum from the Soviet Union. And she told me about her grandmother and talking about what happened in the Holodomor and how people were digging up bodies and eating them and cutting them into small pieces and putting them into the soup so the children wouldn't know what they were eating. And you want the very perpetrators? Why should the Ukrainians put up with those perpetrators who were never prosecuted in having to do anything with them spiritually? I mean, and you also see the hypocrisy. You'll see Father Josiah Trenum bemoan the overlapping jurisdictions in the United States and the dozens of churches in the United States and people still having the Divine Liturgy in Greek or Arabic or whatever other language, saying, well, they should all combine. They should all, obey canon law. Well, in Ukraine, the switch is very simple. One in, one out. Out with the old, in with the new. It's much simpler, and the circumstances are much more urgent. But, in the United States, different people who go visit different Orthodox churches, and everybody goes to each other's churches, and everybody gets along, and the church that you end up joining in your parish has to do more with, the food that you eat during coffee hour, or whichever church that you were chrismated at, and nobody cares. Everybody gets along great. Yet, Father Josiah Trenham, Jay Dyer, and others, oh, no, we have to have one jurisdiction in the United States that's American, and have a patriarch, and have him at the most likely it would be at the Orthodox Cathedral in D.C., and have him as the parish and everything else. But they specifically prohibit the Ukrainians from doing the same thing. But there's a Polish Orthodox Church, there's a Romanian Orthodox Church, there's a Serbian Orthodox Church, they're fine. But if you're a Ukrainian, nope. I can smell the sulfur from here. The hypocrisy is overwhelming. Okay? And you don't need permission, thanks to the Russian Orthodox Church, ironically. You don't need permission from someone else to go in to form your own church. The Ukrainians aren't going into schism. They're bringing themselves into compliance by having a church that obeys civilian laws. And you're not above the law. The Tsarist remnant in Ukraine has spied, recruited soldiers for Russia, has blessed, and is part of a church that has blessed Russian weapons that are used against Ukrainians. If you are blessing weapons and you are boosting the morale, you are a party to the conflict. No country, and if you think Ukraine is being unreasonable for locking up a few of the ringleaders, I've got news for you. You don't even know anything about American history. Do you know what FDR did to Christian identity people in World War II? He determined that Klansmen were potentially, hypothetically, at risk for being radicalized by Hitler. Every single Klansman, every single person who was in Christian identity, every man, woman, and child, not just the preachers or the elders, every man, woman, and child in that church was put into internment camps like Crystal City, just like the Japanese and Germans and Italians were, and they were kept there years after World War II ended. Study your own history. Believe me, compared to FDR or Winston Churchill, Zelensky's a pussycat. That's just a fact. You are not above the law. There is no way Constantine would have legalized Christianity if he thought that Christians would exempt themselves from laws against sedition, treason, and espionage. We'd still be in the catacombs being fed to lions, if that were the case. You have to obey the law. And you have to, in other words, the point of Christian nationalism is that the church supports the country they live in, and that the hierarchy actually lives in the country that they support. Now, they don't have to, the Ukrainian Patriarch, he doesn't have to be put under house arrest in Kiev. He can travel. But he should be a citizen. He should be Ukrainian. Patriarch Bartholomew is simply recognizing the reality. The Ukrainian coalition has deeper pockets than Russia and its Solovikis do. Now, the oligarchs could continue to fund Russia, or Putin could try to fight over their money, and they could fund it for a while, but they're not going to outfund the United States. The thing about organized crime and stealing, as well as other types of socialism, is this: it's all fun and games until you run out of other people's money. It is correct, and if you do meet the patriarch of your Orthodox Church, or you do encounter your bishop, Put in a good word for Patriarch Bartholomew and the true Orthodox Church of Ukraine that is controlled by Ukrainians and not by Soloviki mobsters that harvest the organs of little children and commit war crimes so unspeakable that they can't even be described in detail, much less filmed on YouTube or Rumble. They would be considered snuff films. So let's all do the right thing. But the good news is this. The Ukrainians love Orthodoxy so much, they're not going to let the Russians steal it from them. They're going to do it the right way, and they are doing it the right way. Anyway, this is White Lightning 777 signing out. Long live our republic, long live our empire. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.